Hey everyone, my name's Matt, and I made a mistake recently by not using the Batch API when I should have. Well, to be fair, I didn't really know that it existed, but I was working on a project that required me to generate a lot of embeddings for a bunch of PDF files that I was uploading, and I could have saved myself a lot of time and money, which is why I'm here today to tell you a little bit about the Batch API and how it can save you time and money. So, what is the Batch API exactly? Well, the Batch API allows you to send upwards of 50,000 OpenAI requests to be processed by OpenAI asynchronously. These batch jobs can take upwards of 24 hours to complete, and this is mostly determined based on how the size of your batch job and how busy OpenAI is at any given time. It supports numerous of the existing OpenAI models, as well as any fine-tuned models you have created. Unfortunately, right now, it only supports the chat completions API and the embeddings API. So when would you use the Batch API? Well, you would use the Batch API in a scenario where you wanted to classify a large data set and it didn't need to be done immediately. You could also use it in a scenario where you need to calculate the embeddings for a large amount of files. In a real-world scenario, it might look something like this. Let's say I have a video and it has a bunch of comments. I might have a background job that runs daily to gather up all those comments and send them to OpenAI to be processed for any potential community violations or inappropriate content, basically. Or it can do basically anything you don't need an immediate response for. So how is the Batch API used exactly? The first thing you do is you generate a batch file, and you'll see an example of that here in a minute. You'll upload that batch file to the Files API, and then once that file is uploaded, you'll get an ID back. And you'll take that ID and then you'll create a batch job using the input file ID that you just got returned from the Files API. You'll then pull the status of that batch job until it reaches a completed status, and then you'll go back to the Files API and pull down the results. Let's go through an example of the batch file format. So the batch file format is nothing but a line delimited file of JSON objects. And each JSON object has 4 root keys: the custom ID, the method, the URL, and the body. The custom ID is an ID that you generate on your own. The method is the HTTP method that matching the OpenAI API that you're targeting, whether it's the embeddings API or the chat completions API. And then you'll have the URL, and in this particular example, I'm using the chat completions API. And lastly, you'll have to provide a body. The body is nothing more than in this particular example, the chat completions request body that you would typically send if you are not using the Batch API and you were just using the regular chat completions API. And again, you're just going to have one object per line in this file. That's all it is. So if that wasn't confusing enough, let's go through an illustration. We have our application on the left and OpenAI APIs on the right. Our application is going to send a batch file to the Files API. That Files API is going to return a file ID once it's successfully uploaded. We're going to take that file ID and use it as the input file ID when we create a batch job with the Batch API. The Batch API will return an ID that we will use when we begin to long pull the Batch API for the job completion status. Remember, this is all done asynchronously. When we're done pulling and we've reached a completed status, the Batch API will upload the results to the Files API, where we will need to go request the results and then bring it back to our server for further processing. So what are the pros and cons of the Batch API? Well, the Batch API is designed to save you money and computing resources. Additionally, it's designed to save OpenAI money in computing resources. It allows you to free up compute on your server, and it also allows you to go beyond the typical rate limits that you would get with the synchronous APIs. There are primarily two drawbacks to this right now: that it's only limited to the chat completions API and the embeddings API, and that it can take upwards of 24 hours to complete. However, I've seen it done in a matter of seconds as well. It largely just depends on how busy OpenAI is at any given time and how large your batch job is. There's no better time to go through an example, so let's do that right now. Okay, we're going to go through a very basic example of how you can use the Batch API using Python. I've gone ahead and created my Python project with some sample code that we'll walk through together. Additionally, I have a batch file called mybatchfile.jsonl, which contains a list of JSON objects that match the structure or schema that you saw in our presentation earlier, that has a list of messages asking OpenAI to classify or categorize movie descriptions. Okay, that's all it does. It's going to take a description of a movie and tell us what category that movie is in. Back in our Python code, we first start off by uploading our batch file using the files API. You can see that here in this particular example where we call openai.files.create. We pass in our file, our batch file, and give it a purpose of batch. The files API will return a response, and it will give us a file ID that we will use later. Now we can actually create our batch job. You can see here that we have our batch job created using the openai.batches.create method. We pass in the input file ID that we generated earlier when we uploaded our batch file, along with the endpoint that we're targeting and the completion window. You can additionally provide additional metadata for your personal use in case your particular scenario warrants it. Okay, once we get our response back for creating our batch, we will have a ID that we can reference when we're polling OpenAI for the job completion status. So we're saving that ID to the batch ID variable here, and we are simply going to continue through a loop of fetching the batch job and then checking if that batch job is in some sort of done status. And that could be one of four things. It could be either completed, failed, canceled, or expired. And we will continue through that loop, taking a 3-second break in between each iteration until we reach that one of those completed states. And once we've reached one of those completed states, we'll break out of that loop. And if we're lucky, it should have a completed status. Once we have a completed status, we're going to grab that output file ID, and then we're going to go back to the Files API and pull down that file, and we're going to print out the results. So let's run this script and see what happens. You can see that we've uploaded our file, we got a file ID back, and then we created a batch job, and we got a batch ID back. Now we're going through the typical flow where we're long pulling the batch API, and it first starts off with a validating status to make sure that we are submitting a valid batch job. And it's actually validating your batch file when it does this, okay? And then it goes into an in progress state. That means that it is processing your batch job, and it's going to eventually get to a point to where it goes into a finalizing state where it's wrapping up the processing of all your requests and then submitting them to the Files API, and then ultimately we'll get to a completed state where our batch status is completed. And you can see here that I outputted the results of those API calls, And if we take a look at the results, we can see the main genre of this movie is likely action. The main genre of this movie would be science fiction, crime thriller, romantic comedy, so on and so forth. So you can see here that it was fairly easy to get the Batch API up and running fairly quickly. All we had to do was create that line delimited JSON file, uploaded it to the OpenAI Files API, and then create a batch job with that file ID, and then simply wait for that batch job to reach some sort of completed status, whether it's completed successfully, failed, or canceled. And then once we've reached that completed status, and if our batch job went through successfully, we can actually go back to the Files API and fetch our results for further processing. If you like this video, go ahead and hit that like button. I'll also be creating a lot more content surrounding OpenAI in the future, so go ahead and subscribe to the channel while you're at it. I want to encourage you to also check out funkrunner.com. The link will be in the description. Funkrunner.com is a service that I built that makes it super easy to integrate function calling into your stack. Again, thank you so much for watching my video, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.